So, welcome back to the Psychosynthesis Sessions, where Ryan, my good friend Ryan, and I shall be discussing all things psychosynthesis, and indeed gently questioning and perhaps reimagining psychosynthesis. This is episode 5 in season 1. So we've come a long way, and today is going to build on what's come before. So what in particular are we getting into this week, Ryan?
Yes. Well, Alan, we're on episode 5 and chapter 4 of your wonderful book, The Act of Imagination. And this chapter is called Imaginings.
Dun dun dun.
Moving on from the last one, we're talking about influences, bringing into imaginings. And wow. This chapter, I think, was the most impactful for me. Definitely as a therapist. I mean, I'll say more later, but really kind of confirmed a lot of stuff that maybe I was doing intuitively, but also just really tells a very coherent story of why that might work. And definitely brings in a lot of new things. So it was really inspiring. And I think it's also, there's something for everyone in this book. If you're into philosophy, you've got, the philosophy chapter. If you're into history of ideas, you've got that. And if you want a really kind of practical kind of way of approaching therapy, or even of just understanding the process that you're in, if you're a client, or why things are working and why other things aren't working, or whatever. It's So, and what I really liked about it is there was something very satisfying about just bringing all the threads back
From there earlier in the book, it all comes together.
Where you're doing this meta thing of, it's like a magician, it's like a magic trick or something. You've set out the theory, but actually all along you've been applying it in the structure, in the process that you've been taking the reader through. So I really enjoyed this one.
Nice one. So you sort of recognized what you were doing, and it sort of clarified. You saw what you were doing as a therapist.
Yeah, I also saw very much things that I have done wrong and may continue to do wrong, but but it gave me a language to go, that's why that didn't feel right, or that's why that felt right.
Yes.
I mean, one more thing on that. Yeah, there's something about the way you've presented it. It's actually, it's almost like, I don't know, you're deepening an understanding of what is taught. It's not like a radical break with counselling, or with counselling skills. These are all kind of skills and interventions and ways of being with a client that are in our training, and they're in, and not just in psychosynthesis. A lot of it's quite person-centered in a way, but just it's just giving such a depth to why that's important, and kind of like a context for understanding the whole journey, really, which I really appreciate.
Lovely. Oh, neat. Yeah, I mean, it does tie things together. I mean, it's mysterious, like the process of writing a book, but in some ways I was aware that the whole book was leading up to that final chapter. The main reason for which is that this final chapter is a bit of it's kind of like, this is where this spaceship takes off kind of thing. It's kind of like the first 3 chapters are building the launch pad or something, to provide the basis for me to share how I particularly do psychosynthesis, which is what this last chapter is. Because I was at pains to go through the teachings, go through the techniques, go through the influences. I want to say out loud to provide me with the freedom, the rationale, the space to then lay out what I do and why I do it and why I think it's psychosynthesis, even though it might not be completely recognizable, the language and the interventions, but it should be at least partially recognizable.
Well, it's
Um,
your reasoning that the whole journey that you take the reader on,
uh,
by the end of it, you're going, "Oh, yeah, of course this is psychosynthesis."
there you go. Nice. That's very affirming. I like that. I'm maybe always a little bit on the back foot. I'm always a little bit shy or anticipating people not understanding. It's the hazard of being experimental and inhabiting that tension between destruction and creation and
Yeah, yeah,
doing things differently.
yeah, yeah.
There's a
But
hesitation around being somehow being misunderstood or questioned. Yeah.
but also, you know, a testament to your congruence as well, you know? So I think I'd be worried if you weren't worried, you know? You yeah, you're not.
You're right to be worried. Yeah, nice. Right, so let's get into it. Where should we start?
Well, maybe I mean, you've given us, I think at the beginning of these episodes, you brought in why this book was important for you.
Hmm.
Maybe kind of come back to that a bit and say, why was this, what was important? Because it was also quite personal.
Hmm.
That's what there was, yeah, it was a very, again, you're taking a risk to be congruent with doubt and
Hmm.
inner struggle as a therapist, and that,
Hmm.
yeah, maybe say a little bit more about that and as a context to, the content.
I think there's a few different strands or responses to that question, that invitation. I mean, this chapter goes way back to my childhood. I mean, I grew up running around outside all the time in the 70s, building tree houses, playing football, walking the dog, going to the beach. Um, and the other big influence in my childhood wasn't just Enid Blyton, but I read a lot of Enid Blyton. I loved comics, and then I graduated to Enid Blyton, the Secret Six, and then the Seven, the Secret Seven, and then the Famous Five, and then all the other Enid Blytons, and then I just kept going, and I read, and I read, and I read, and I read. And I was definitely healing myself, or I don't know if it's healing. It's just like you're drawn to stories. I was going to say those two things supported me through perhaps stressful changes and things.
Mhm, mhm.
And also maybe it's just sort of innate that children are drawn to nature, for want of a better word, the outdoors, wildness, because they are wild and they are nature themselves. Um, and they've not been, alienated from that yet by getting rammed into a desk for 12 years. Um, and also they're drawn to stories because I think children are, if they're lucky to have a safe enough early environment, they're just inherently, animistic even. Everything's a story. A cloud is lonely in the sky. A stick is a person. Your doll is certainly a person. Your action man is a character. And it's all very unself-conscious and spontaneous. And you slip in and out of pretending to be a prince or a lion, and then you're back in time for dinner time. So there's a sort of shape-shifty, imaginative reach and aliveness and creativity and story that's very special to me. And there's a thread running all the way through my life of at times losing that and at times finding myself depressed, anxious, alienated, and just knowing that the two things that would bring me back would be a reconnection to nature and story. I mean, I've long known that, when times are hard, just read a novel. It will help. And one of my continuing interests and research questions is, why do you feel better when you read a novel? Isn't that mysterious? Um,
Aren't you doing? I think you're doing some training on that. Aren't you doing a workshop on that?
I'm going to do a little presentation next month called "Why Fiction Matters" (brackets for therapists), and I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to pitch an argument that therapists need to read fiction, not just nonfiction. I think nonfiction gives you good ideas, good theories. What fiction gives you is stories, and I think ideas are like data points. They're like isolated notions, whereas life is lived in a joined up, holistic way. And I think that's what reading fiction gives you. It gives you the arc of a life. And I think it's really, really important as therapists to understand their clients as, well, living characters, not just data points, not just theories. So that's just an excuse for me to talk about that.
Well, I'm guilty of that.
For what? Sorry.
Well, of the bias towards nonfiction, I have to. But I have to make a very conscious effort to force myself to read fiction.
Well, you're not alone. There's sort of a discussion online about, particularly men don't read a lot of fiction, and there's different theories about it. But one of them is that men want to get a usefulness out of their reading,
Mm.
and they're drawn to nonfiction for that reason. I suppose what I'm going to be arguing is that there's very much a usefulness, or an applicability, or you'll get something, practically speaking, from reading fiction. Also at the moment, there's a kickback against self-help books, which I quite like online. There's a sort of growing meme around, don't bother with self-help books, or just read Tolstoy or Jane
Yeah,
Austen,
yeah, 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 yeah.
which I'll sign up for that.
That's
So,
one of the ones I have read recently is Tolstoy. And
yeah, what are you reading Tolstoy
no, I
was?
read oh, Resurrection. Is it the
Mm-hmm.
Resurrection?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was fantastic.
His third novel, yeah, about the
Yeah,
prisons.
yeah. I think I like his later stuff where he's all spiritual.
I read Anna Karenina on holiday recently, and the last 50 pages is such a payoff. It was, I don't know, it was really trippy. It was psychedelic. I just felt so in touch with the mystery. He has this lovely way of not tying things down and making you feel connected and not in control of your life, but that's not a bad thing. That seems to be that's what I get from him
Oh,
anyway.
okay. Well, yeah, I got a couple more at a charity shop the other day, so a couple more Tolstoys. So I'm going to keep delving
But
in.
yeah.
Maybe this is a possible future podcast.
We'll
Uh,
definitely come back to reading fiction
yeah,
and
yeah,
fiction therapy and how to work with clients who read
great.
novels. But I guess we're just talking about my influences, and I think um, when I was training to be a therapist, there was at times an encouragement to, do psychosynthesis your way, figure out how you understand and apply psychosynthesis. And I really took that to heart, and that gets mentioned throughout the book, I think. And the previous episode that we did talking about influences, we were talking about, every psychosynthesis therapist does draw upon their influences, and these are the influences that I draw upon. So the upgrade from Enid Blyton and building tree houses in later life in regard to being a therapist was Jungian therapy, broadly speaking. So Jung, James Hillman, Mary Watkins, Robert Bosnak, Robert Romanation. Um, on the one hand, so that's like the Enid Blyton side, fiction, stories, dreams, and on the other side, we have not building tree houses, but we have eco-psychology, ecotherapy. That I think they're my two main influences, and they come together in this book because I've always kind of, well, I guess I wanted to bring them together in synthesis because I think ecotherapy, eco-psychology is great because it is a way of thinking about and practicing therapy that includes the world and relating to not just trees, but also lampposts and, well, wherever you are, not just your inner life. So it contextualizes the person in the surrounding world, not just relationships to other people, but also to place and environment. But it doesn't talk about imagination very much. It talks in a sort of humanistic way about feelings and thoughts and sensations, but not images. And obviously, the Jungian therapy is all about images and a sort of imagistic approach. They talk about an imaginal world, but they, by and large, do that within a consulting room setting, and maybe even a sort of personal psychological setting, your personal dreams, etc. But for me, imagination was never just personal. I never really understood it that way because when I was out building the treehouse, I was in my imagination, and the reading the novels fed back into building the treehouse, and it was joined up. I wasn't just reading the novels to enjoy the novel. I was reading the novel to go away and pretend to be a character from an Enid Blyton novel. I became the character. Um,
Was this with friends? Were you?
yeah, I mean, I wasn't a complete nut job loner person. I mean, it was different things. It was like me and the dog would spend a lot of time together. My lovely dog Jet, that I inherited from my granddad when I was 8 years old. He died. My granddad died, so we had to take on one of his dogs. So, like, all year round, I'd be the first one up in the morning, and I'd go out, and we lived on the edge of the countryside. So in the dark, in sunshine, rain, snow, I was out walking the dog, and that was a formative influence. I had a lot of time outside, and I'd talk to the dog, and we'd have little adventures. But also, there was a lot of kids running around. It was the '70s. We were outside all the time.
Yeah.
Parents weren't watching us. We had bikes. We, we played games, big chase games, and and maybe shared our reading a little bit as well. There was a bit of that around the edges at school. So yeah, I didn't go to the cinema. We never went to the cinema in the '70s. TV was the thing in the '70s.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of an influence, but not hugely because, well, there's only 3 channels and children's TV only lasted for an hour.
Well, I think it was the emerging kind of VHS
Yeah, that was
stuff.
when I was teenager. Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
remember someone getting a copy of Star Wars or something, and that being like we watched it like
that would be a
50,
big deal.
50 times.
That was a big deal when I saw Star Wars on a video. Yeah, because we missed it in the cinema. So yeah, and then psychosynthesis definitely talks about imagination, doesn't it? So in some ways, I was a happy chappy because it was all there for me to draw upon. Assagioli very much validates the importance of imagination, and in respect to the book and the sort of principally approach in the book of psychosynthesis being an experiential synthesis.
Hmm.
Saggio writes about how imagination is itself a synthesis. So he writes that, imagination isn't really a standalone, like, psychological function, if you like. Psychological functions are like feelings, thoughts, sensations, intuitions. He writes of how imagination is a synthesis of your feelings, of your thoughts, of your
Yeah,
sensations.
I had a
And
question about this bit, Alan, if
yeah, go
that's
on.
all right, because I noticed there was some, because I followed where there's a reference to where Asajali talks about it, because it's always confused me. Yeah, he does this critique of Jung and tries to position him, positions himself as having a different perspective on Jung, and he kind of critiques Jung for having a kind of synthetic approach to
Yeah,
imagination,
I know.
and arguing, well, and saying, well, why didn't he create? His argument in that article is, well, he obviously doesn't care about imagination because he didn't create it as a separate function. But then, as you've just argued, in other parts, in other areas, he does treat it as a synthetic function. I mean, obviously, we've been talking a lot about the differences in Assagioli's, between different, slightly consistencies. But I don't know, is there something that I'm missing in?
No, I think I make that point in the notes, and I quote the section from the talk where
Yes.
Assagioli is comparing himself to Jung. It's not Jung, it's Jung. My German friend told me one time, and yeah. So when Assagioli is talking about imagination includes sensations, my understanding of that is that he's thinking about, like, you're doing a guided imagery session and you perceive yourself to be in an imagined environment. So you have the sensation of sight, an imaginal sensation. That's how he's talking about it, because he's very clear in this contrast to Jung, because for Jung, imagination included the physical sensation of sight, not
Yeah.
just like the sort of eye
Okay.
of imagination, but the actual physical
I
eye.
see. Yeah. Yeah.
So for Jung, imagination wasn't just a sort of inner experience like images in the mind. For him, it was that also, and it carried over into all experience, into perception. So
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah,
so
I
for
hadn't caught that.
yeah,
Sorry.
so for Jung, that's why he doesn't isolate imagination, because for him, imagination is synonymous with psyche. Image is psyche. Every psychological process is an image and imagining, Carl Jung writes. So he doesn't see a difference between psychological life, broadly speaking, which, if you like, includes all our feelings and thoughts, our relationships, our perceptions, our actions. That all goes into psychological life. It's not just when we close our eyes and notice imagery. That's his much broader understanding of imagination. Whereas Assagioli sees this synthesis point, but then says, how can imagination be connected to the physical sensations? That's ridiculous. So he's definitely more on the sort of dictionary definition of imagination, which is pictures inside the mind,
Yes,
disconnected from the senses.
that makes sense. Yeah, I was. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's almost like uh, there's two types of seeing, two types of feeling, two types of sensations. One in the real world and one in the inner world. For Assagioli, it's like that's why I wanted it as a separate thing. Why? But why do you think that was important to him to see it in that way, or to his system?
Well, I mean, there's evidence that he doesn't see it that way as well, because, like, in chapter 2, we talk about how he likes to work with analogies. And one of the case examples, so there's a guided imagery session with Daniel, the client Daniel, and he closes his eyes, and I guide him through and show the reader how to do a guided imagery session. And basically, has a little story journey in this imagined landscape where he finds himself on the staircase, the steps of the Bank of England, and to the right hand side there's party noises, and when he looks up, there's the music, the chatter is coming from an open window, and there's the shadow or the silhouette of a woman standing in the window. And then this woman steps into the light and he recognizes her. And then his sense is, I'm not sure if she wants me to be here, if she wants me to go to the party or not. And then we finish the guided imagery like I always do. I say, is there anything else you'd like to say or do? And he says, I'm running up the steps to the party, but they seem endless. So anyway, what I write about then is how Assagioli sees these guided imageries as analogous to the client's everyday life. And he says there's a lot of value to be had in working analogously, I suppose is the word. So it's not too difficult to then notice when you listen to Daniel talk about his normal everyday life, where he's not literally standing on the steps outside the Bank of England, but he is finding himself again and again in situations where he doesn't quite know if he's not quite sure if people want him to be there or not, and he's doing things to try and get that approval, but it seems a bit endless and tiresome and not effective. So it's so in that sense, he doesn't spell it out explicitly, Assagioli, but to my mind, implicitly, that would be an example of him doing something not dissimilar to what Carl Jung's doing. And also the reason he doesn't go as far as Carl Jung is because Assagioli, to my mind, held on to a subject-object dualism.
Yeah.
And talking about psychology as a subjective inner experience. And Carl Jung very much threw that out. He started out talking like that, but when he got into his later life and especially when he started talking about alchemy, that all fell away for him.
I didn't realize. I mean, when you said Jung, so Jungian psychology were part of your influences. Is that something that happened before you discovered psychosynthesis, or
yes,
right?
Yes.
Mm.
Way before I got into way before. So I think it might have been via Robert Bly. So I read a book called Iron John, which was a big seller in the 90s by Robert Bly. And that which is a lovely book about a Grimm's fairy tale. And he talks in that book about the failure in modern society of the initiation of men. That's his big theme. Men are not helped to move from childhood to adulthood as they traditionally were. So they remain these kind of kidults. They don't actually mature. They're not initiated into manhood. And that's why we have all these idiot politicians and whatnot, because they're immature. Yeah, and all that. Yeah. So that's the sort of later word. But yeah, he would have. Yeah. So, but that was a way in, because Robert Bly was versed in Hillman and that more archetypal approach. And then there was King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. That was another big book at that time by, forget the authors of that book. And that led me into reading Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is Carl Jung's sort of autobiography. It isn't really. It was kind of sort of, he spoke to somebody and they wrote it up, and it got very heavily edited after he died. But that's a great book though.
Okay. Do you want to say a bit more about, because you mentioned Daniel. So Daniel is the case, kind of clinical example, you could call it that, or a vignette of a session or a number of sessions with a particular client that illustrate some of the ideas that you illustrate really well, actually. I think your practice, how to apply these ideas, basically in context. But in terms of what those ideas are, so we've got where do you want to go on to? Because
well, I think yeah, okay, thanks. So I think just to mention briefly, so imagination is a synthesis. So that's why image-based techniques are well used in psychosynthesis, because the cultivation of imaginative life is itself a psychosynthesis. And arguably a psychosynthesis is the cultivation of imaginative life. So where I went in the book and where we're about to go in our conversation is I really take that ball that Asad Julius, hit over the fence, hit over the not the fence, the net. Here you go, Alan. Here's some ideas about imagination and some image-based techniques. And I definitely bat it back, as it were. Because there was always a sort of disgruntlement or a frustration that took me a long time to figure out with regards to how imagination was used in psychosynthesis, because it wasn't helping me become more imaginative. I mean, I started psychosynthesis training in one of those periods that I mentioned earlier, where I was a bit depressed, a bit alienated, and trying to get my imagination back. And training to be a psychosynthesis therapist was one of the things that I did that I thought would help me, just like reading novels helped me. And, soon enough we were, it's all sorts of image-based stuff. You're making masks, you're running around doing psychodrama, you're imagining characters on chairs, you're dialoguing with these characters, you're doing drawings, you're writing down your dreams. But it wasn't helping me get my imagination back again, and that's I think that's where definitely the book Waking Dreams came from, my first book, and also that evolved further into this book because it led me into the research question: why is a psychosynthesis that values imagination not helping me get my imagination back? And the answer is, dun dun dun. It's very simple when you think about it. It's obvious when you say it out loud. Despite valuing imagination, psychosynthesis psychotherapy doesn't actually, it takes imagination for granted, if you like. Number one, it doesn't actually emphasize being imaginative for imagination's sake. It assumes imagination's there, it takes it for granted. And then basically it uses imagination to generate image content, which is either designed to change the client and or generate imagery to interpret the client's life. All of which is fine and has a place to some extent, but for me, that misses out on the main thing, which is that just being imaginative in and of itself is healing, regardless. And so what I've basically written about is the process of being imaginative, as opposed to trying to create image outcomes. So when I do the guided imagery in chapter 2 with Daniel, I'm facilitating his experience of entering into an image environment. And he tells me what that is. And he tells me what he sees and feels and thinks. And he tells me what he wants to do. I have no agenda for where he needs to find himself, what he needs to do when he arrives there, or where he's meant to be getting to. It's all relying on the innate imagery that's present in the client's psyche. And then you can do that analogy thing really well that Asad Julius talks about, because the imagery that you're exploring is directly reflective of their psychological life. And as we'll see, as we've already seen in the analogy discussion, it's reflective of the activity of imagery in their everyday life. So what I do in the book is I question the limitations of what I call an inner imagination, which is the kind of normie assumption in a lot of psychologies, not just psychosynthesis. So they kind of picture imagination as an inner world that somehow you, the client, are in control of, and that you can manipulate to achieve particular outcomes. And they'll describe that inner imagination in, like the inner child's a good example. The child that you meet in imagination isn't just a child, it's your inner child. Okay? So there's some philosophical assumptions,
Yeah. Yeah.
big
And
ones.
inner critic.
The inner critic that gives the inner child a hard time. So just putting the word inner on the front of child isn't neutral. It signposts that the child that you meet in imagination is somehow personal to you, a subjective aspect of your experience, possibly implying a connection to your childhood self, possibly implying that you are there to parent this child or somehow in control of this child or can give the child what it needs, assuming that it needs something. It sets up a whole constellation of assumptions, and that changes your imaginative experience, because I think meeting an inner child is quite different to meeting a child. Like in a dream, when you meet a child in a dream, it's not your inner child. It's a toddler. It's distressed. It's crying. It's
Yeah.
snotty.
Yeah.
It's rolling around in the mud, and it's angry with you, and you're a bit frightened of it, and don't know what to do.
That's an
It,
interesting. Yeah.
but when you wake up and then you kick in with this theoretical framework, and you come to think about the child that you met in the dream as an inner child, it moves away from being an autonomous character on the same level of autonomy as you are to a symbol, really, of your childhood or your vulnerable self or your.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. Well, yeah, because you're I hadn't really, you're projecting quite a lot of, it's quite loaded, a lot of associations that you might be projecting on that, like, as you said, that implication that maybe it's my child, it's my inner child, therefore I have to parent this child. You're kind of coming in with a set of preloaded responses to the child in a way. And that might be true. Do you know what I mean? It might be true for you that you have the instinct to care for this child or you want to parent this child or whatever. But what you're saying is that don't come in with that assumption. The language can make you come in with that assumption rather than that emerging from the exploration of what your reaction to that child is.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because for me, say if Daniel met a snotty-nosed, angry, rolling around in the mud toddler in his guided imagery, I wouldn't be at pains to, like, do anything other in the first instance of finding out what that was like for him to meet that child and what his response. I mean, we do that in the guided imagery. What's it like to meet this child?
Mm,
How do you feel about this child? What do you think about this child? I wouldn't slip in inner child,
mm.
or a child subpersonality or a child archetype, because that's something that can happen with this inner imagination paradigm. Is it slips in inner child unwittingly,
It's very
and
subtle.
then you've created a cognitive distance, because now you're not meeting the child,
Yeah, yeah.
you're meeting the inner child,
It's
which
it's very
which is an idea.
it's very subtle, and it's also very pervasive, very kind of ubiquitous in therapy language now.
And just the wider culture,
Become. Yeah.
it's a pop psychology term now. But I think it moves you away from the imaginative experience into an idea or a theoretical understanding of it.
Yeah.
And
I had something else I wanted to kind of. I mean, again, I should have like a little flag that I hold up
for
with,
future episodes to be
with
discussed.
well, tangent alert or something.
Well, maybe we'll get into it. Let's see.
Because
Let's see what you've got. You usually
well,
have good
no, it's
ideas.
the idea of that separation between inner and outer, between this is the
Mm,
imagination, this is the
mm,
real world.
mm.
Yeah, there's, as we discussed outside the podcast, was something, your emphasis, your your current kind of focus, I suppose, is on that, on how that plays out for within therapy,
Mm.
within a relationship with ourselves and maybe the immediate others. I'm always kind of going to the wider context in a way, um, and there's a political dimension to that as well. It's a real strong political dimension to separating out the imagination to the real world, because you hear that theme. I mean, you don't have to pay attention to current political discourses and the parties that are expressing hope, or the few parties that are expressing hope, get accused of being naive, get accused of
Ah.
being,
Mm.
disconnected from reality because they're imagining another world. I mean, that was a phrase of the kind of activist movement at the end of the 90s, is but called "Another World is Possible," and also of you mentioned Mary Watkins earlier,
Mm.
of
Mm.
liberation psychology. That's why Mary Watkins transitioned into liberation psychology, really, because she was working with the imagination and realized the kind of political importance of imagination to be able to imagine another world. And like actually that being a necessary part of shaping another world. Anyway,
Another reference along those lines is Mark Fisher, who wrote a wonderful little book called Capitalist Realism. And he's got a line in that book. I don't think it's his line, he just quotes it. And he says, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world
yes, yes,
than it is the end of capitalism. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism." And that's basically what you're speaking to. It's it and I can certainly relate to that to some extent. You know, there's these dystopian ideas about climate change and whatnot, and or AI is going to take over the robots are all going to kill us. I mean, we can imagine that happening so much easier. It's
yeah,
almost like that's passive.
yeah.
Um, it's almost like that's just inevitable. Things are always going to be getting worse. It takes a lot of work to protect your imagination and to push back against these naysayers that you're talking about, and to come up with a more positive alternative. And I think for me, the underlying crisis that fuels all the other crises is the crisis of imagination, because the attack on like story and dream and imagination, and it starts early on. Don't be so dreamy, Alan, and you've got to be real about this and grow up and be objective. The attack on imagination and dream and the impoverishment of our collective imagination is what arguably gets in the way of imagining a utopia, I guess, rather than a dystopia.
Or even,
Yeah,
no, it doesn't necessarily have to be a utopia, but
just an
any form
improvement.
of
Yeah,
change beyond the norm, really, beyond the status quo.
I think
There's something that maybe links back into this chapter here is, and maybe it's jumping ahead. So tell me if you need to kind of flesh out
let's
something
find
else
out.
first. But um, because I think that you go on from that introduction about imagination and how psychosynthesis is an imaginative process, or that there's a unity between the two, and then to go on about the role of story. Okay, and what we're just been talking about, that dystopias and utopias is a shutting off of the future in a way.
Mm,
Well, it's a particular, I think, people have their personal dystopias, and we kind of can shut off from even imagining a better future. And sometimes even it's like, that's why I'm a bit, I've always been a bit cautious of the ideal model, and and how it's applied, because you you know sometimes even the suggestion that there may be a better future ahead, that
mm,
there is a possibility of another future, can be incredibly upsetting for the client, because
mm,
it highlights the distance from where they are now to where they've they got to go to. So their survival personality, or the survival strategy, is to not think about the future, is to not even go there, and not think about potentials, not think about, you just, get into whatever those habits that keep you going.
Mm.
So the suggestion of change itself is can be really, destabilizing. Anyway, I don't know if that kind of sets up something.
That does set up quite a lot. I think that's very true what you say, and in some ways, this chapter's a way around that, or a different way into that. Because I think while what you've said's true, it's also true that people are imagining the future. It's just that they're doing that in a really small way, or in a very timid way, and the important thing for me is to notice their imaginings, their alternative imaginings in the moment as they're happening. So I'm very much avoidant of the shadow side, if you like, of what's called the ideal model. So I don't think we spoke about this, but we talk about it in chapter 1, and then I do come back to it in this chapter. And it's one of Sagioli's main experiences or teachings. But it's much misunderstood because he's at pains to point out that it's like, just back up a little bit. It's just another example of maybe a Sagioli not choosing the best names for his terminology. Because the word ideal,
Yeah.
he literally says something like, to paraphrase, he says, the word ideal should not be taken to suggest an idealistic vision of the future.
Okay, we'll use a different word then.
Yeah. So he basically, when you read the nuance of what he says, he's saying it should be approximate change. It should be a realizable next step that we envision as our ideal model. So the opposite of, like, in 5 years' time, where might you like to be? For somebody like who you described, that would be almost a shaming question for them. If you can't even imagine tomorrow being different to today, why ask somebody 5 years' time? I mean, it's done in in a positive way, because the intention is that will get people to think outside the box. And sometimes that might work, but it can be shaming, or they just give you a fantasy. You got to be really careful as a therapist of getting your clients to give you what you want to keep you happy. Because a lot of people are sort of pleaser types, and they need you to like them. So if you ask them, where do you want to be in 5 years' time, they might give you a big story about that, but that doesn't mean it's like genuine or sincerely felt. It might just be an abstract idea, and they're feeding you what you want. So for me, the important thing is to stay with the experience that they're having. And I lay out in the book 4 stages of psychosynthesis. Now, there are different versions of the stages of psychosynthesis, and I just thought, well, I'm allowed to have my stages of psychosynthesis. So so let's just run through those stages. That might create a nice little structure for the rest of the
Yes,
episode.
yeah. Is that, I mean, do you want to come to, because what I particularly really liked the breakdown of the story world into these 3 areas. So you had like psychological functions, perceptual situation, dynamic timeline.
Yeah.
Do you want to come back to that? Do you want to?
Well, I think that's a good place to start, because I write about that with regards to, well, all the way through the stages, but definitely in stage 1. So for me, stage 1 is story identification. So these stages are kind of like, broadly speaking, the progression of a therapy, or even just the progression of a session. I mean, don't take them too literally or linearly, but it's a good idea to think about different aspects of the work. So the first thing to do is to clarify the client's story identification. So in psychosynthesis, we talk about identification quite a bit. We've spoken about that earlier in the podcast. Normally, it's spoken about as a sort of limited range of thinking and feeling and sensation, which for me, again, sort of misses out on the perceptual and the relational and the actions in the world. It misses out on how the client sees the world. So that's why I talk about a story identification, which includes, well, let's get into what a story is, because I think that's what you're talking about. So what is a story? So story is a bit like imagination. It's one of these words that we use all the time and we kind of understand what it means, but we couldn't really say what it is. And there's different definitions or indications of what a story is in the literature. And I draw upon them and footnote them in the book. But the version that I come up with is that there's 3 different aspects to a story. The first of which is it's a synthesis of psychological functions. So in a story, there will be feelings, there will be thoughts, there will be sensations. The second aspect is that will all happen in a perceptual situation. So a story happens in a place. It's not a decontextualized story. It's usually about a character in a scenario, maybe with other characters, or in a world. One of the things that I explored in my previous book was images are places. You know, we think about images as paintings on walls or photographs in magazines, almost like two-dimensional, static, freeze frame things. But that's just what a photograph is, and that's what a painting is. But when you look at the painting properly, you enter into an image landscape. A dream's certainly an image landscape, and certainly your life happens 3-dimensionally, not 2-dimensionally. And then the third aspect, which is related to what I've just said about the difference between, you know, a static photograph and imagination, is that a story happens along a dynamic timeline. So it's always sort of coming out of the past in the present, but it's always sort of anticipating an ending or emerging into or unfolding into the future. So it's like life is situated between the past and the future, and the story that we inhabit and the character that we play in that story has emerged from the past and will be anticipating the future. And that's what brings us back to this, like, can't imagine change thing. I think on a sort of fine grains level, everybody's anticipating the future, even if that's like, what's my therapist going to say
Yes.
next?
Yeah.
Or what am I going to have for dinner? Or where's the next turning in the road? It's like life's always coming at us, and we're always having to respond to that.
Which
And
is where the kind of Eckhart Tolle thing, that's why that's so kind of, that was, well, for a period was very popular.
the power of now, the power of
Power of
now.
now, and that's what that's what I really liked about the way you framed it, is that yes, and, you know, yes, and, you know, the now is, and that's that thing of like seeing they're not separate. Like, if you see everything through imaginative experience, then past, present, and future are all part of that experience in the now, right now. You're experiencing all of those things now, which I love. I love the you pulled out a quote. I wanted to mention this to you. You pulled out a quote from Assagioli where he was quoting someone else, where he said, "Past, present, and future are all merged in the inclusiveness of the moment that is." It's a lovely quote. Do you know who that quote was? Because I did some digging to find out.
Go on then.
It's Frank Herbert.
From Dune.
Yeah.
Dune or June, if you're
Dune,
Scottish.
yes, depending where in the country you come from.
I love Dune. Maddie.
Anyway, I thought you might be interested in that.
That's a nice bit of fun fact.
Anyway, tangent.
Do read Dune, everybody.
Yes.
It will help you. That's fun. So the story identification, I mean, there's all sorts of different ways to do that or work with it. And the way that I share in the book is how, after a while with the client, I'll make that conscious between us. I won't use the word identification, but I'll talk about story. Stories, like, for me, is a cuddly, organic, friendly word.
No,
it's not like an abstract technical term. It's in the everyday parlance. So I'm happy to use story. And if we run with the example from Daniel that we mentioned earlier on, that begins in chapter 2, he's like in a guided imagery session, running up the steps, not sure if they want him in the party. There's a girl in the window. So I return to that case study and work it through these stages in chapter 4. And because I'd gathered multiple examples from talking to Daniel over a period of time of different sort of versions of that same story from the guided imagery, analogies basically, like we mentioned earlier on, then at a certain point I said to him, it's kind of like you're a man in a story. It's kind of like it's a story, your life's a story about a man who finds himself, just paraphrase, finds himself in a situation where he's not too sure whether he's wanted or not. And he puts a lot of effort into trying to make sure that it's okay for him to be there, but he's not sure if it's worked. And this is getting harder and harder for him to keep up. But he's not quite sure what he can do otherwise, or what it would mean to not do that.
Yeah.
So,
So you set him up for that.
yes.
So it's not you just jump in with this. I'm going to sum up your
But yeah, I
whole.
don't prescribe it to him. That's right. Good point. Yeah.
You kind of you work with a particular incident, and out of that comes this kind of story presentation that you kind of you work out together, and then it
Yes.
gradually, like I think it gets to a point in the work where you then offer it up as a more. Oh, we've been talking about this, and this story's come back again and again, and then could we just, you're kind of widening it and offering it to say, does this kind of describe something a bit more general about what's going on for you?
Yeah, so it's that's good to remind me about that. So it's a co-creation. It's not like
Yeah,
I'm prescribing it to him. I literally say, I'm going to have a go at telling you this story, and you see how it lands, and let me know if there's anything missing or that needs changed. And then we just back and forth a little bit, and we come up with a story he's happy with. And then, like you say, this is then the sort of perspective, if you like. It's in the third person, which is a bit weird because normally experiential work needs to be in the second person. Like the therapist would say, you feel sad, rather than a man felt sad or a man feels sad. But we move into the third person because that gives you a generic story template. I mean, we're stripping out all the details. It's not about the Bank of England and a party. It's a situation. It's a generic situation. The feelings and thoughts are in there, but that means you can then see it in other situations where the specific details will change. So it becomes a sort of lodestone, or sort of like go-to reference point in the therapy to return to again and again, and it might get refined over time as other information comes to light. Which takes us to stage 2, maybe. Let's do stage 2. So stage 2, once you've clarified the identification, because the identification, remember, is the limitation. This is the story that's a restricted story that's now not working so well. And it's already starting to change because he's wondering what it would be like to put that down, but he's not sure about it. So he's still doing it. Story disidentification is where you help the person to begin to free themselves up from the identification. And in the book, this is a nice segue for me clinically in the case example, because we move into working with the not eyes closed imagery, but how Daniel is imagining me, the therapist,
yeah, yeah.
in the consulting room. So there's this thing called the transference, which is a technical term for how the client pictures, perceives, understands, experiences the
Yeah.
therapist.
Really
And
great that you shared this. I really
mm,
liked this choice of. You could have given another example of this, but just it's again not shiny piece of writing. showing your vulnerability, as I suppose, and also maybe speaking to the a very common fear amongst people who are training to be counselors, or early counselors, of, oh no, what if my client says that they're bored, or that it's not working? How do you deal with that? It's a really elegant example of how you might deal with that, just on that level, just on that level. So
The worst thing that can happen is your client doesn't like you anymore.
yeah,
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 that's what happens. Well,
yeah,
it doesn't, because the fun thing about it was, I'm imagining that he's disappointed, because what he's saying is, in the transcript, he's like, "Why are we doing this? We're not getting anywhere. This isn't working." And what makes it a story disidentification is I'm simply helping him to notice and describe his experience of the therapy not working, of him not getting anywhere, and the feelings and thoughts.
yeah.
Um,
But in order
this,
for that to work,
mm,
the therapist has to do the same thing. The
the
therapist
therapist, you need to
has
allow
to
your,
has to
go on.
disidentify from their imagined story of what's going on in that moment. That this client is disappointed in them.
Yes.
That's where the countertransference is coming up in that moment. The therapist is having to do the same thing in order to
Yeah.
hold
It's very
the.
easy in the early days to go, "Oh my goodness,
Mm,
I need to explain to them that they're wrong, and that actually I really like them, and that actually
mm,
we've made a lot of progress, and I'm a great therapist." And that would be to act out your insecurity and your fear of being disliked. No, so you need to sit there and allow the client to perhaps not be quite happy with what's going on.
mm.
You
Still
need
might
to
be a
allow
bit, in, no matter how one's experience one is, those moments can still be difficult. Still.
100%. I think that never goes away.
Mm,
It's just you get better at being with the difficulty.
mm,
I think it always hurts when people don't like you. That's just a normal human response. I don't think you become inured to that as you get more experience. Or I don't know if that would be a good idea if that's what happened.
mm,
If you
mm.
just get numbed to whether a client likes
Yeah,
you or
because
not.
the reaction is part of the information, isn't it? It's part of it.
Exactly. And it's part of your connection to the client, because they're feeling frightened, saying what they're saying, and you're picking up. His feelings aren't personal. So it's more just that you get better at, like you say, not reacting to it or not acting it out, and not coming from that place, which is a disidentification. Yeah. So disidentification doesn't mean not having the experience. It just means having perspective on the experience. But the fun thing is that it seemed to me that he was disappointed, and then in the transcript, it's like I say to him, "Any ideas?" Because he's like, "This really isn't working. I don't know what would make it better." And I was like, "Have you got any ideas?" Again, just leaving it open for him to say what that is. And I was expecting him to demand more of me. And he says something like, "Well, I think you're holding back. I think you could be harder on me. I think you could challenge me. I think, we could speed things up. I think I could work harder."
Mm,
Okay. Which, the smarter listeners to the podcast will realize is another repetition of the story identification. Another example of Daniel imagining that I'm not wanting him to be there because he's not making sufficient progress, and he wants to demonstrate that he is good enough by working harder. That's what he does. That's how Daniel rolls. So it's no surprise that that starts to happen in the therapy session. So at some point in these transference exchanges, there's always the tricky point where the client says, "Is that what you really think about me? Do you really think that I'm a
mm,
disappointment
mm.
and that this is a failure?" And of course, I'm literally thinking, this is great by this point, because here we have this wonderful repetition and it's coming into the therapy session directly now, which I always think is a good sign, that the
If you
client's beginning
notice
to
it.
feel, if you notice it, because the client must feel safe enough to bring that in. They're not just talking about difficulties in relationships elsewhere. It's coming into the therapeutic relationship now. Um, but in the transcript, I mean, it's easy in a transcript to it's harder in real life. But in the transcript, I was like, well, I'll tell you what I am thinking about what's happening right now. So I don't share transparently that I think this is progress.
But you do disclose something which
Well, I say
you're
to him,
giving the client something.
yeah, I say to him, what I'm thinking right now is that what's happening between us and what you've just said is another example of the story that
Mm,
you have
mm.
about. Remember that story that we came up with the other day about a man who. And then there's a few beats go by, and then Daniel's like, "Oh yeah."
The aha moment.
So it's like a little epiphany because he recognizes himself in the story, not in retrospect. We're not talking about what happened last week or last year. It's in the moment. And those are the most transformative moments when you recognize the story as it's happening. And then I say to him, and what's that like to recognize yourself in the story? And he says, well, it's weird, which is one of my fun. I always say, what kind of weird? Um, And he says, well, it's weird because I'm still in the story. It still has traction. I still believe that that's what's happening. And also at the same time, it's not the whole story. There's something else going on that actually you might not be thinking about me like that. And actually I might be doing okay. And that actually might be quite happy with me being here and I don't need to work harder. And I'm like, job done. So that's, which takes us into story emergence. So you've got when somebody disidentifies, not only do they gain perspective on what they normally do, but something new comes into the mix. It's a synthesis of more than. And so so stage 2, the story disidentification, blurs into stage 3, the story emergence, which is that there's something new beginning to happen. The client's not quite arrived in a new story yet, but there are the intimations of a new story arising. So then I continue to talk about that. And I just track and I give an example of a slice from a session where Daniel comes in and he's describing a more assertive behavior, a more confident behavior, where he's not anxious and he's saying what he thinks spontaneously without overthinking it and worrying about what people think about himself. I just feed that back to him and again, we're just like noticing that that's new. And then as you're saying, what's that like? So again, it's just very simple. Like you said earlier on when we started, it's very simple, almost like person-centered counseling. And
Not
he's like,
yeah, so it's not rushing towards another story.
no,
There's a nice quote pulled out as, "We never quite know what color or shape our wings will be." Isn't it? That's, so you just gotta wait and see what happens in the chrysalis.
yeah, you can't force the client into a new story. You can't decide what story they're going to enter into. You just need to
Mm.
be on the lookout for what that is. Once they've come out of the chrysalis, what kind of wings will they have? What kind of colors will be their wings? Um, and to begin with, they can't really fly. Their wings are already sticky and stuck together maybe, and they're not very strong either. So they need to dry off in the sunshine a little bit and flap around a little bit and get up the courage to fly. And that's what story emergence is like. That stage is a fairly vulnerable stage that you need to kind of protect. I mean, I kind of see the consulting room as a safe enough place to begin to help the client to lean into or notice these possibilities. I mean, it was happening in his life, and we can sort of slow that down and help him recognize that that's happening in his life. Because the danger is you just fall back. The momentum's to fall back. That's the safe thing to do. Um, and there's always an oscillation back and forth, which is how we end. Because stage 4 isn't what the listener might be expecting, which is like the new story, which it could have been. But I think more importantly and more realistically, stage 4 is called living between stories. And it's a recognition that the client is inhabiting this kind of in-between space where they're both in the previous story identification and at the same time in this new story. And it's just a little transcript of me recognizing that in another situation that Daniel brings. And I then say, and what's it like? So I reflect back to him that there's these 2 stories now. It used to be just one story, your anxiety, you're feeling like you don't belong and working really hard. But it's like there's this other story coming in, and then I articulate that new story. So we start to shape up the new story that he's stepping into. But what we do is we put them together. So now I'm summarizing not just one story or a new story. I'm summarizing what's it like. So it's a story about a man who's in this story, doing this, and he's finding that sometimes he's not worried, and he's feeling freed up to say what he thinks. And I'm just really like, again, you're not forcing the change. You're just aligning yourself with the process of change and helping the client to have that experience. And then he has the lens of this kind of double story and living between stories to go back into his life, not just to notice the story identification, but to notice examples of where he's kind of between stories. He's kind of like, I'm not sure if my boss is cool with
Yeah, I
me
like
doing
that
this.
example. Yeah.
Is he cool? But I'm going to say it anyway. And that's that, that's an example of living between stories. And that's what people need. Because, like I say, life's always coming at you. And the story that you're in at the moment might need to change to respond to getting older or whatever it is.
I'm a big fan of the ambivalence, the paradox, the living with the tension stuff. That's
There's no settling down.
well, I mean, that's perhaps the most radical part of this book. The fact that you did not resolve it in a neat way like that, like the news story and a happy ever. And I think it's interesting because in the trust where we both teach the Psychosynthesis Trust, there's an essay title for counselling students, which is about theory of change.
Mm.
And there's a few different theories of change within the psychosynthesis field. There's nuances, as you could use. Assagioli had, obviously there's the stages of psychosynthesis, but there's also the creative process. There's, as envisaged by Assagioli and envisaged by James
Vargy.
Bardew as well. They're all really interesting perspectives on change, and this is another one. It's a completely different kind of perspective on it. But what often is, I'm trying to kind of, prod a bit of critical thinking, with the students is, and actually, it's a common critical response of students, which is that, but these stages, it doesn't work like that. It's not a linear, like, I think we're quite resistant maybe in the modern age to like these kind of, it happens like this, then you go through this, then you go through that, and then ta-da, and that's not only have you left it open-ended, you've emphasized this kind of iterative nature of life, really, which is
Iterative and aligned to the experience rather than an abstract theory about how change happens. Yeah.
yes, yeah. But it's non-linear, it's cyclical. You'll be,
It's never ending.
It's that, just living with the tension, the ambivalence, the both and,
Yeah, I mean, what, and this may be a nice thing to sort of end on, is that the living between stories and that ambiguity that you're talking about, for me, that's a sort of antidote to the idea that change happens by finding a center, a unifying center within, and then integrating around that center, building it up strong enough to then provide the basis for you to create a relationship to transpersonal self. That idea of a center, that's never quite worked for me. The idea of there being a sort of even an essence or a core or an authentic self that's fixed, that's almost like never changing, like despite everything else changing around it, there is this core you that you need to find. And also the word integration as well always has for me connotations of like a static model of change. It's like, I've integrated my anger, done.
Yes.
I've integrated that split off memory, done. Whereas for me, it's kind of like life's unfolding and coming at me, like I say, it's a process where there is no stasis. And I think, did we talk about the metaphor to a forest the last time? But like, of course, I look in the mirror and I look a bit like I did last year and the year before. And so you end up thinking that you are sort of, there is something that is you, a sort of essence. But, and I'm not saying that's wrong, and I'd be open to being proven wrong, but I would see that as a metaphor, not a literal truth like we started with. This is not the truth. And if we allow that to be just a theory, not literally the truth, that allows us to open up to a more dynamic understanding of self that maybe does change, maybe isn't completely essentialized. And the project isn't about unifying and integrating. The project's more about moving through successive stories. And what I love about a story is it sort of decenters self, because it's certainly not just about your inner life or your personal life, because a story contextualizes you in the surrounding world, in how you respond to the environment and other people. It includes your past, your present, and your future. So it places you in a timeline. So it's not static in that way either. And it's never ending. So it's very fluid. And that's the ambiguity that you're talking about, which hopefully speaks to the experience that people have of change a little bit better than some models.
That feels like a good place to end. There was something I did want to share. I don't want to.
Go for it. This is the
The
extra bonus point from Ryan at the end.
Yeah.
For those that have listened all this way to the
Yeah,
end.
well done.
Well done.
No, it's just it was something quite personal for me, I think, in this chapter, which was I remember my moment of story disidentification, which led to me coming to the trust, really, which was I used to work for a peace and reconciliation center. It's called St. Ethelburgers, and I was there running, helping develop kind of narrative approaches to, at that time, conflict resolution. So I kind of ran a human library event, which was about people sharing their personal stories to kind of encourage empathy with difference. And yeah, it was at we developed I think it's still going actually. There's a thing called Stories That Harm, Stories That Heal, Stories That Harm. There's a project, a narrative project about how to resolve community tensions using story.
St. Ethelburgs.
St. Ethelburgers.
Ethelburgers. Yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah, I think that's still
So
going.
I was at one of these events. So we did train. There were some training events as well. I was at one of them, where one of the exercises was we had to go do some pair work, and come up with or tell a story from our lives of where we overcame something where we struggled and overcame. And I remember not having a story to tell about
Mm,
overcoming. And I kind of realized at that moment that I was caught in a pattern of kind of negativity about myself and my life.
mm,
And it really overwhelmed me. I couldn't do the exercise. I went off to the toilets to have a cry. Um, but it set me off on a path, to kind of, at first, before psychosynthesis, it was narrative therapy. I was going to go and train in narrative therapy. So the story was very much my metaphor when I came into psychosynthesis. And that's one of the reasons I actually struggled with subpersonalities as a model, and still do to some extent, because it felt like a decontextualization of the character in the story. It's
yeah,
like we need to be talking about the story in which this character makes sense,
yes,
and change, and how it's kind of, you could turn it completely around. You could say that these characters arise from the stories, not the other way around. It's both and thing. Anyway, I just wanted to share that, because that was really profound for me to read this chapter and have those threads tied together.
oh,
So I've held it as a doubt, as an ambivalence around subpersonality work and stuff, but there's something that really brought it together.
it reconnected to your
Yeah,
original sort of entry point
yeah.
and the language of story. Yeah, subpersonalities don't really get mentioned in the book. Um, for that reason, really, I agree with you. Yeah, I'm more interested in the story, the context, which includes what I'd call imaginal characters, but
Yes.
that doesn't mean they're sub parts of you.
Yeah. I suppose
Yeah.
the other thing that I kind of, up until this book, and the
Mm,
previous book to some extent, was
mm,
kind of like, oh, image seems a bit like the
mm,
word image, the words imagination didn't seem to encompass enough for me, but you've defined it in such broad terms that now it does.
mm.
So, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. Oh, that's cool. You being a bit of an artist and everything as well, and drawing, painting. Yeah, cool. Good stuff. Have we come to the end?
I think we have. I
Shall I
think we
do
have.
this?
Yes.
Should I do the podcasty things at the end? Which are thank you for listening to the end. There is no prize other than, I guess, what you got from listening to the end. Um, do maybe share the episode with a friend that you have who you think might like or benefit or appreciate these discussions, and perhaps a rating or a
Mhm.
comment,
Yeah.
on
Tell us
whatever
what you
platform
thought.
you're on.
Tell us
Yeah,
what.
tell us what you think, dear viewer,
Uh,
dear listener.
yeah, yeah. I like reading
We
notes.
we we do
Maybe
respond
have a
to
chat.
comments.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, share it with someone, and that way we'll make the world a better place. Sharing psychosynthesis, one person, one podcast at a time, because we do need to reimagine the world, don't we? That's probably an end note. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, everyone watching or listening. Take care, and we'll be back for the final part of this
Yes,
series.
episode 6. Find out what that's about when we arrive.
Yeah, yeah.
Talking about the final section of the book, the epilogue. So it'll be a nice yeah. There's a few important things to say there about what psychosynthesis is and where the book took me and where it might be taking us next.
All right. In the words of Allan Frater, go well.